Before I start, I want to mention that Ms. Holding did in fact draw attention to this distinction, very much in passing in the podcast with Mr. Brennan, and where Mr. Brennan is arguing for whole sign places, Ms. Holding said, well, there's this stuff, these distinctions about general and particular, which I'm sure she has picked up from Firmicus Maternus, but also from Valens, because she's read both of them in English translations. Now, I have to say something more about this general versus particular, because it could be misleading. I don't know what Ms. Holding's view is on this, on what I'm about to address, but I'm going to tell you what is the case in Valens, and almost certainly is the case in Firmicus Maternus. Firmicus Maternus, as I said, he borrows the word platikos from Greek and opposes that to partiliter. But he uses it almost in a pedagogical context. He will say that it is better for the learner to first be exposed to something platicus or platike in a platic or broad or general manner before then getting the more specific or detailed examination. He uses it just regularly as a pedagogical device. So in a sense, he's kind of punning on the astrological meaning when he's setting out the broader framework of his own teaching of this material. All right, now, what we need to be careful about here is what do we gain from the general treatment, the platike treatment, versus what we get from the moirikos treatment. There's general versus specific. Because when Valens talks about platikos, he will oftentimes pair that not only with zodiacos, or in terms of sign, but he will also say kathalu for the general treatment, putting a more specific slant on the word platikos that itself has this very, very broad, refers to broad and general treatments. Why am I making this particular qualification? Because kathalu in Greek means according to a whole, according to the whole. And what is kathalu, according to the whole, what is general in that sense, is true on its own account. It is true. When you're looking at something according to the whole, what is being asserted is in fact something that is true at that level. Now, this is important. In other words, you can say something that is true about all animals. You can make a universal statement about animals. There are different kinds of animals. Whatever it is that you say about animal will apply to the different species of animals, even though the different species of animals have distinguishing characteristics that set them off from each other within the framework of all animals. Now, this is very important because when it comes to the moirikos or partiliter examination, it means you are not, in the detailed examination, finding something that is a correction of the general statement. There is something that is true in the general statement that always has to be kept in mind, and then when you get to the detailed treatment, that detailed treatment has to be understood within the general treatment. Now, if, in fact, in Greek, you wanted to say that something was true for the most part, recognizing that there might be exceptions for some class of entities, you would not use the word kathalu. You would use something like for the most part, epi ta palu, or some other such Greek expression. So Valens is telling us, just through his word choice here, that the general treatments provide something that is true on its own account, and then the detailed treatment has to be understood within the framework of that general treatment. Valens does not restrict the general and the more detailed or specific to the context of places. He will say that there is a general treatment of aspect based on signs. And then there is a more moiricose treatment of aspect if in fact the planets are aspecting with each other within a certain range of degrees. There is truth there's truth to what you say about the sign-based aspect that is always in the background of how you would interpret the degree-based aspect. Valens even talks about lots in this manner, that there was early on, sometimes lots were calculated zodiacos, only according to sign, and not according to degree. So you might have something where one lot calculation will position the lot in terms of whole signs, in terms of signs, it will position the lot in a bad place, or its ruler will be in a bad place. But if you do it in terms of degree, it will end up being in a good place, or its ruler will be in a good place. Valens says that you have to understand the particularity of the degree-based calculation within the framework that the sign-based calculation of the lot has actually provided. Okay, so we never have, with the degree-based treatment, a correction of the general treatment. We always have to understand the degree-based treatment within the framework of the general or sign-based treatment. Okay, very important preliminaries for what I'm trying to say. Mr. Nelson.
It sounds like what you started to say sounded like the Ploticos and the Moiricos might be in some sense in opposition to each other, but really that's not the case at all.
Thank you for saying that. I didn't mean to convey that. I meant they're only opposed in terms of sign versus degree. But it's very good that you brought that up, so I can make sure that I didn't mislead somebody with this. I mean, they are distinct accounts, the general versus the specific, but they're not opposed.
Would you say that the more specific account would participate in the more general account?
Yes.
Never loses that meaning.
Never loses its own truth.
Rather than a correction, is more of a refinement.
A refinement, not a correction, but a refinement. If the Greek text or Valens had wanted to say that when we look at this generally or in terms of sign, we may, in fact, something might be true for the most part, but there might be an exception, one or more exceptions to it, he would not have introduced the word kathalu. I mean, this is very well established technical Greek philosophical language, and he certainly wouldn't be going against the grain as far as that was concerned. And now, with those preliminaries out of the way, I would like to start looking at the Firmicus Maternus text. This is Book 3, Chapter 2. And what we have in this chapter are systematic expositions of all 7 planets in each of the 12 places. So this is quite a large block of material. Now, I said earlier that, at least alluded to the fact, that many of the texts, particularly delineation texts, are actually being excerpted by certain authors from earlier sources, or in this case, directly translated from those Greek sources. This particular chapter, long chapter with the delineations of planets and places, is in that category. Now, I also mentioned, or have mentioned, that many times these source texts are written in, the original source texts are written in such a manner that you are meant to snag or trip over certain passages. This is the compositional device that is used in these early source texts, and it takes a long time to master. Now, if you were to write delineation text for all 7 planets in all 12 places, and you were writing a book on this in modern times, you would probably set out to begin with some general delineation template, and then you would be fleshing that in for each planet in each place. You would be identifying ahead of time what your principles were for generating delineations. Lay that all out ahead of time, and then every time you have a planet in certain places, apply the principles of that template. And every time you have a planet in a place, you would want to apply all the principles in that particular delineation. This is not the way these texts are composed. There is no general delineation template laid out ahead of time. Instead, the actual delineation template, if you want to call it that, is distributed throughout the text in different treatments, in different delineations. So in one delineation, you will get part of that template. In another delineation, you'll get another part of that template, and so forth. So that after you've read the entire delineation text, you will have some general idea of what must be said about every delineation of planets and places, even if it is not explicitly addressed in any one delineation. So the delineation template is spread out throughout the entire block of delineations. Now, if you don't keep that in mind, you might think that something that is not said in one particular delineation context was not meant to be said there. That is not true. You are supposed to learn something from one delineation that you are able to transfer in an appropriate manner to a different delineation context. So you always have to keep this principle in mind when you are reading these kinds of texts. Now, in addition to having the general delineation template distributed throughout the entire block of delineations, you have usually a slow unveiling of the meaning of terminology that's being used in the delineation template. Usually, in this type of writing, what will happen is a statement will occur right from the beginning, and there will be ambiguity to that statement. In other words, in the particular texts that we're going to be studying, that ambiguity is going to concern the Latin word pars, which means simply part or portion, and often degree, and the word partiliter. The word partiliter is not defined in this block of delineations. The meaning of it has to be inferred from the different contexts in which it's actually used. That is how these texts are written, and I can't stress that enough. Now, the problem that we're going to have, as I said, is whether the term pars means degree or whether it means more generally some portion of a whole sign place. And this is made, it is made more difficult to determine this because in Latin there are no definite and indefinite articles. This makes the problem more difficult because you don't know whether you're saying a part, meaning a degree, the part, meaning the degree, a portion, more generally, or the portion. Those matters also have to be determined by comparing oftentimes sentences that are nearly parallel constructions, but not perfectly parallel. It's the shifting way in which the statements are made, in the nearly parallel statements are made in different delineations that will be the clue to what the word pars means in a given context, and then also the word partiliter. All right, now I'm going to begin by reading the two sentences that immediately precede chapter 2 in book 3 and anticipate what's going to be going on throughout the delineation text. Now, first of all, I'm going to read two sentences, the very final two sentences in the previous chapter that immediately precede chapter 2. And I'm going to start with James Holden's translation. He says, "But even though these things are thought by some to be defined only generally, many things should also be stated in detail in this book. For the stars will then have their own efficacy if they are also located precisely in their own individual houses." Now, in the first sentence, "But even though these things are thought by some to be defined only generally," that word that Holden has translated as generally is actually platike, the word that we discussed earlier, which can mean generally, but almost in the astrological context, particularly in the context from which Firmicus Maternus has borrowed this word and simply transliterated it, it would mean zodiacally. In other words, even though these things are thought by some to be defined only zodiacally, many things should also be stated in detail in this book, but what Holden has translated as in detail is in fact partiliter. So we have here a contrast between platike and partiliter immediately preceding the delineation text that I'm going to start examining. Holden has taken the non-astrological sense, general versus detailed. I'm saying that this is quite strongly zodiacal versus something connected with degrees. Not necessarily the very degree, but something related to an examination that is based on degrees rather than signs. The final sentence then, "For the stars will then have their own efficacy if they are also located precisely in their own individual houses." The word that he has then used here as precisely is again partiliter. "For the stars will then have their own efficacy if they are also located partiliter in their own individual places." Now, this should be a warning to us right from the beginning that we are going to be playing off zodiacal considerations with considerations based on degree. Not necessarily individual degrees, but it can very easily be a portion of a sign. But this expression now from Firmicus Maternus should catch your attention. "For the stars will then have their own efficacy. They will be able to effect their own significations if they are also located partiliter in their own individual places." Remember, planets in their relation to places can effect, affect, or endow with a form. The partiliter usage here is clearly associated with the ability of the planet to effect its own significations. That's exactly what that sentence says. Okay, now, earlier in Book 2, Firmicus Maternus laid out his system of equal places. This was a partiliter canon for determining the equal place system. This was a partiliter treatment. So the equal places from the ascending degree are identified or being identified with the word partiliter. And the partiliter there is not necessarily the single degree. What's being referred to is, in fact, the range of 30 degrees that belong to that equal place. Now, when we come to the actual delineation text in chapter 2, we've already been alerted to the fact that many things must be treated partiliter, as well as being treated zodiacally. We've already been alerted to this. Now, the simplest and most natural thing to think is that because partiliter has to do with equal places from the ascendant, and platike or zodiacos has to do with considerations involving the sign, that what we are doing is trying to compare the equal place with the whole sign place. The cusp of the equal place neatly divides the sign into two different regions. One of those regions, from the cusp of that, the equal house cusp, equal place cusp, in that sign to the end of the sign, would most naturally be the partiliter zone, simply because of the way Firmicus Maternus has used that term when he set out the system of equal places. This would be the most natural thing to say from the outset. Now, when I can't remember if I said this earlier, I may have, but James Holden, when he has a footnote when Firmicus Maternus lays out the system of equal places, he says that this is the second house system invented by the Alexandrians, but then goes on to say that Firmicus Maternus doesn't use it. And the reason he says he doesn't use it is because in the actual delineation text, we're talking about initially about signs as places. I'm saying that in point of fact, the equal places are being brought in at the same time in the same investigation by invoking the word partiliter. They are being used, but they are being used along with the whole sign places. This has been my theme, my hypothesis, if you will, from the beginning, that we have to deal with the whole sign places along with the equal places. We cannot ignore either system. We need to find a way of using them both together. And this is, in fact, the solution to the problem of house division in the original source texts. There was no problem. There was never a problem. I maintain that the system of equal places and the system of whole sign places were conceived of together. Mr. Nelson, do you have any comments on that, or I'm just getting warmed up?
It seems sensible to me when things are laid out in front of you that this is an interesting and rather innovative view of this, the elements that have been sitting there in the text. I think we're going to see some examples.
Yeah, we're definitely going to see a few examples.
It simplifies things as well, even though it seems like they're two layouts to work together. It simplifies things when you see how it is clearly laid out after working through these texts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, without these distinctions being made, you don't know how to delineate planets in places. What I'm talking about here is not something just theoretical. This is of critical, practical importance. If you don't differentiate these two ranges or these two sectors within a whole sign place, and if you don't know what it means for a planet to be in either of those places, you cannot delineate planets in places. This is a huge missing part of the puzzle for the Greeks. So what I want to stress here, this is practical. I mean, this isn't Schmidt off on one of his, his philosophical ruminations about something. This is highly practical information. Now, this Firmicus Maternus block of delineation text is not easy. I've already told you that it was written in this manner that bears the signature of these early Greek source texts. You cannot read these as though they were essays, or as though the author is simply going through and trying to say things as clearly as possible, the way we would be taught to write an essay. That is not the style here. So what you're going to have to bear with me a little bit, because I'm going to focus on a very narrow number of statements in Latin in this chapter, and I'm going to compare them with each other. And what we're trying to do is pin down what the word pars means, portion, and what the word partiliter means. And when the word partiliter is dumped into the delineation or the statement at the beginning of a delineation, we need to understand what that is actually telling us. All right, now, the word partiliter, just as a translation of the Greek word moirikos, could have three basic meanings. One of them would be exact to the degree. That would be a perfectly good translation of partiliter. Valens sometimes will use the adverb moirikos in just that manner, referring to an exact degree. A second possibility for partiliter would be a certain range of degrees. It's still partiliter because we're talking about something based on degree rather than based on sign. One possibility in these texts themselves would be the delineation identifies the cusp, say the ascending degree, and then partiliter might mean a range of degrees, say before that cusp and after it, that are under the influence of that cusp. This could be justified on the basis of usage that is in fact found in Valens and other writers writing in Greek. The third possibility is that we are simply looking at a range of degrees, but a part of the sign, either the part preceding it or the part preceding the cusp and the part following the cusp. In other words, the sign being partitioned into two regions. The word partiliter, which really just means by portion or in terms of portion, can equally well apply to this third scenario that I have mentioned. Of course, you probably know by now where I'm headed and which of these I would prefer. All right, now I'm going to read